Hello, Algebra 2 people. I'm going to take you through the student activity sheet number 3. We're starting on page 19, so go ahead and turn to that page. We're going to start out by classifying numbers. If you remember, during our last class, we talked about complex numbers. So complex numbers, remember, are in the form of a plus bi. Okay? So when we have something like this, we have two different parts to our expression. So the first part is a number, okay, and the second part, okay, and that number is going to be real, and the second part is going to be imaginary. And you know it's imaginary because there's an I hanging out at the back of it. All right. So we're going to take a look at complex numbers, imaginary numbers, and real numbers. So complex numbers are in the form of a plus bi. Imaginary numbers are going to have an I associated with it. And a real number, it's just going to be a plain old number. Okay, so take a moment and pause the video and see if you can figure out what all three of these would be classified as. Okay, hopefully you had a chance to pause the video. The first section, because we have a 2 plus a 3i, we have a real part plus an imaginary part, these are known as complex numbers. Okay, taking a look at the next piece, all of these have an I hanging out at the end. Okay, no other like addition or subtraction associated with it. So these are just plain old imaginary numbers. Okay, fun fact, remember that I is equal to the square root of -1. All right, and then last but not least, we see a whole bunch of numbers. So 4, -5, 7/10, all that other good stuff. So these are just plain old real numbers. All right, and that's how we might classify some numbers. All right, so continuing on, we can take a look at how to combine some like terms when we are dealing with some complex numbers. And it's very similar to what we would do with variables. So if we take a look here, first thing that's jumping out at me is that we are subtracting. And I know that oftentimes we make mistakes when we are subtracting a binomial minus a binomial. So I'm going to change this to plus, and I'm going to change the sign to everything inside the parentheses. Okay, remember I can do that because it's like I'm distributing that negative. All right, so now I'm going to combine some like terms. And this time through, I have my real part. Okay, so my real part, I take 2 plus a -5 to give me -3. And then I have my imaginary part. I have a 3i and I have a 7i. So 3 i's plus 7 more i's is going to give me 10i. And that's how I can combine my like terms. All right, it's so much fun. We're going to do it again. This time through, we're going to be adding. Okay, pause the video, see if you can try this one out on your own, and we'll compare. All right, welcome back. Let's see if we can combine some like terms. So I'm seeing a real part hanging out at 3 and -6. If I add those together, I have a -3. I see my imaginary parts hanging out here. I see a -5i, which I might think of as a -5i. And I see a -4i, which I might think of as a -4i. So a -5i and a -4i gives me a -9i. So you can choose to write that as -3 minus 9i, or you could choose to write it as -3 plus a -9i. Either of those would be acceptable. All right, go ahead and flip. Let's see what else we got. All right, so now we're going to combine some more like terms. We have our kind of like our word bank hanging out at the top here. So pause the video and see if you can decide which answer fits best with each of those blanks. All right, welcome back. Hopefully you had a chance to take a look and fill in the blanks here. For this first one, I'm seeing 3 i's plus 7 more i's. I'm going to combine some like terms, and that's going to give me a 10i hanging out there, adding my coefficients. All right, taking a look down at the next one. All right, I'm seeing that I have a 2i. Okay, I'm seeing an 8i. Okay, those are my imaginary parts. And then I have that 3 hanging out. Well, on the other side of the equation, I got a 3, so the 3 is already taken care of. So if I combine my like terms of 2i plus 2i plus 8i, I get 10i. All right, so taking a look at the next one, I'm seeing 3 plus I minus that 5 plus 3i. All right, I know that we're often to make mistakes with those signs, so I'm going to go ahead and distribute that negative through. Okay. So I combine, I have 3 plus negative 5, that gives me negative 2. I have an I plus a negative 3i. I add those coefficients. Remember, there's an imaginary 1 hanging out in front of that I, so 1i plus negative 3i is going to give me a negative 2i. Okay. Now we're going to work backwards. All right, so I know that it's going to be equal to 7. Okay, on the left-hand side of the expression, I have 4, so I know I need 3 more to get me to 7, giving me 3 plus 4 gives me 7. All right, so taking a look at the imaginary part, I know I want to be left with 1i. I have 2i so far, and I need to add something else. Well, I know that 2i minus 1i is going to give me what I need. So I can write that as 3 plus a negative I, or to match what's up in the answer blank here, I'm just going to write this as a 3 minus I. All right. And then last but not least, all right, I have 4. I need something else to get me to, well, I don't see a real part hanging out here. So I might think of that as plus 0. So I know that 4 and a negative 4 together are going to give me 0. Taking a look at the imaginary part, I have a negative 3i, and I want to get to a positive 7i. So I might work backwards and think, all right, what minus 3i gives me 7i, and I'm missing a positive 10i, because 10i plus a negative 3i gives me the 7i. All right, there we go. All right, let's continue on then. Okay, like we talked about in class, we know that I is equal to the square root of negative 1. Okay, so for part A, if we type into our calculator, and let me pull my calculator up here to the side. Okay, if I type in, make sure I'm hanging out in the correct mode here. If I type in the square root of negative 4, it's going to tell me calc error, non-real answer. Okay, so we know that we're looking for something that's imaginary. So I'm going to go ahead and rewrite this square root of negative 4 as the square root of 4 times negative 1. Now there's a rule in math that says if we are multiplying two things inside our square root house, we can break them up into their own square root houses. So I can rewrite this as the square root of 4 times the square root of negative 1. I know that the square root of 4 is 2, and I know the square root of negative 1 is I. So the square root of negative 4 simplifies to 2i. Okay, if I want to take a look at negative 10, okay, why don't you go ahead, pause the video, try this one out, and we'll compare. Welcome back. All right, I'm going to split this up as the square root of 10 times a negative 1. So I'm going to break those out into their own square root houses. So square root of 10 times the square root of negative 1. Square root of 10 is a gross decimal. There's nothing else perfect inside of it, so I'm going to leave that as it is. Okay, and square root of negative 1 is I. Okay, typically we write our I first and then our square root stuff. So I'm going to simplify that fully to I times the square root of 10. All right, and then last but not least for this section, I have the square root of negative 9/16. Okay, go ahead and pause the video and we'll compare in just a second. All right, welcome back. I'm going to rewrite this as the square root of negative 9 divided by the square root of 16. Because if I am dividing two things in one square root house, I can break them up into their own individual square root houses. Okay, to start out, I know the square root of 16 is 4. And that square root of 9 is non-real, so I'm going to go ahead and rewrite that as 9 times negative 1, which I can then break out into their own square root houses. And I know the square root of 9 is 3, and the square root of -1 is I, and it's still all over 4. All right. Continuing on, we're going to take a moment to multiply together the square root of -5 times the square root of -2. All right, and it's asking me to start by rewriting these things in terms of I. So we know that we can rewrite square root of -5 as 5 times the square root of -1, okay, which I can rewrite as I times the square root of 5. Okay, keeping in mind order, usually put the I first. Okay, so now I'm going to take that times my square root of -2 business, which I can rewrite as the square root of 2 times the square root of -1. Okay, which I know I can rewrite as I times the square root of 2. All right. So now it's saying, all right, apply the commutative and associative properties to group the imaginary and the real factors. Okay, so what that means is I'm going to reorder this junk. So I'm going to have my I times I, okay, which is I squared. And I'm going to take my square root of 5 times my square root of 2. Okay, well, I'm going to have I squared. We'll talk about that in just a second. And I know square root of 5 times 2, I can throw those together in their own square root house to get 10. All right, so recall that the square root of -1 is equal to I. So I'm taking the square root of -1 and I'm squaring it. Okay, and this is still times 10. Well, the square root of -1 squared is going to turn into a -1. And I got my -1 times the square root of 10, which gives me a negative root 10. Okay, so we have two big takeaways so far. We know that I is equal to the square root of -1, and I squared is going to be equal to -1. All right, so we can do a bunch of things with I, and we'll come back to that in just a second. All right, so now we're going to multiply these things together. All right, and we're going to find our products. Notice that some of our radicals are imaginary and some are not. Okay, so if we were going to combine this together, the square root of -7, I know I can rewrite as I times the square root of 7. And the square root of -3, I can rewrite as I times the square root of 3. All right, I can reorder and have I times the square root of 7 times 3, okay, which gives me I squared times the square root of 21. All right, and I squared is going to be a -1, so I'm going to write that as a negative root 21. All right, next I'm going to rewrite square root of 3, that nothing to really do there, square root of -3. And I'm going to rewrite my root of -7 as I times the square root of 7. Okay, the I is hanging out, that's the only I have. I'm going to combine root 3 times root 7 as the square root of 21. So I times the square root of 21. Okay, moving on. Okay, I know this negative root 3 is kind of like a -1 times the square root of 3. Okay, so I'm going to keep my -1 hanging out outside my square root house. And inside the square root house, I'm going to do my 3 times 7, which gives me -1 times the square root of 21, which we can just write as the negative square root of 21. Okay, last but not least, okay, I know hanging out in front of these square root signs are going to be a -1. So if I take my -1 times my -1, that gives me to a +1. All right, and then I have my square root of 3 times my square root of 7. Like I said, these two multiply together to give me a +1. And I'm going to multiply my 3 times 7 inside their own square root house together. So I have 1 times the square root of 21, which we'll just write as root 21. All right, continuing on here. Okay, so now we're going to multiply some binomials with our I stuff hanging out in there. And one of the methods that we've used in the past is this lovely box method. So hanging up top, I have a 3 and a -2i. And I have on the side a 4i and a 5. Okay, so again, I'm going to multiply these guys together. So in this first box, I'm looking at 5 times 3, so I got 18. Okay, then I'm going to take 5 times negative 2i. 5 times negative 2 is negative 10, okay, times an I. Then I'm going to take my 4i times 3. Well, 4 times 3 gives me 12, okay, times an I. And then last but not least, I'm going to take my 4i times my negative 2i. Well, I know 4 times negative 2 is negative 8, and I know I times I is I squared. We learned already that I squared is like negative 1, so I have negative 8 times a negative 1, which gives me positive 8. So now what I have cooking here is 15 plus a negative 10i plus a 12i plus an 8. I can combine some like terms. 15 plus 8 gives me 23. A negative 10i and a positive 12i. Negative 10 plus 12 gives me 2, and I have an I there. Okay, cruising on. Okay, go ahead, try to make your factor box here. Pause the video, and we will compare with what we have. Okay, welcome back. All right, start us out. We have 2 times 5, which gives us 10. We're going to have a 3i times 2, which gives us 6i. An I times 5, which gives us 5i. And we'll have an I times 3i, which gives us 3i squared. Okay, we remember that I squared is equivalent to negative 1, and 3 times negative 1 gives us negative 3. So if we combine some like terms, okay, so we start with 10 plus 6i plus 5i plus a negative 3. Now we're set up to combine some like terms, so 10 plus negative 3 gives us a positive 7. 6i plus 5i is going to give us 11i. All right. Cruising on, we're going to take a look at this fun-filled chart for our I values. All right, so we know that anything to the power of 0 is 1. We know I first is like the square root of negative 1, which we just write as I. Cruising on, we have I squared. So I squared, we know, is square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1, which turns out to be negative 1. Okay, but there's lots of things that we can do with I. We keep going. So I to the third is like I squared times I. I squared we know is like negative 1 times I, which turns out to be negative I. I to the fourth we might choose to think about as like I squared times I squared. There's other ways to think about it, but this works. I know I squared is negative 1. I squared is negative 1, and negative 1 times negative 1 gives me a positive 1. I to the fifth, I might think of I to the fifth as I to the fourth times I. I know that I to the fourth is 1, and I will just leave as I, so we end up with I. I to the sixth, I might think of I to the sixth as I to the fourth times I squared, which gives me a positive 1 times a negative 1, which gives me negative 1. Okay. I could think of I to the seventh as I to the fourth times I cubed. I to the fourth is 1. I cubed, we can see up above, is negative I. So 1 times negative I gives us negative I. And then last but not least, I to the eighth we might think about as I to the fourth times I to the fourth, okay, or 1 times 1, which gives us 1. Okay, if we take a look, this whole cycle kind of continues. We start with I, negative 1, negative I, 1, and then we repeat I, negative 1, negative I, 1. So the same cycle will repeat throughout. So if we wanted to figure out something super gross, like I to the 44th, okay, and I know it is repeating in cycles of 4, so I might choose to hit up my calculator and take a look and say that 44, and I divide by 4, okay, so 44 divided by 4 is equal to 11. There's no remainder, so I'm just left with I. Okay, if I take 452 and I divide by 4, I get 135.5. 0.5 I know is like 1/2, which I can think of as 2/4. So if I think of I squared, I'm thinking about -1. Let's back up to that first one. All right, so my remainder is 0, so I to the 0, and I end up with 1. Okay, last one. If I divide out 3,433 divided by 4, I'm left with a 0.25, which I know is like 1/4, which is like remainder 1. So I have I to the first, which turns out to be I. All right, and that's going to do it for all the notes that we have for today. So what I would like you to tackle for the rest of class is in this packet you are going to try 10A and B, 11A and B, and also number 12. Once you're done with that, you're going to go to Agile Mind, where you will do more practice, numbers 6 through 8. All right, good luck. I will touch base with you when I come back. All right, bye.